I think we're good. Mark, welcome along. How are you doing?
I'm good, thank you, Neil. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. Yeah, I mean, well, interesting times we're living in. I've realised that you look as if you're in your home office. I'm in my home office. How's it been the last few months?
Well, I think a lot of people in our profession would probably say what I'm about to say, which is, on the one hand, because it's relatively easy to work from home in tech, it's been fine. On the other hand, you're very conscious that a lot of our fellow citizens are in great difficulty, and so it's always difficult to say things are fine in that context. But at a personal level, I've been able to work through things and get things done, and therefore it's been fine. But I think for the good of the country, I think we'd all like to see ourselves get out of this situation to a little bit more of a normal posture, if that's possible.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny. We've been talking a lot at Incremental recently about what it looks like to get back and how that's going to change and shape. And it's yeah, I think it was funny. We were thinking back the other day to the day that we decided to do the sort of office closure, and it was funny because we'd had a board meeting. Basically, we were in the middle of sort of business planning, that kind of March timeframe. It's always that kind of business planning time and finalising business plans and a bit of a restructure as well at that point in the year. But the thing that was kind of interesting was that when we made the decision to close all the offices, there was a sort of, it was almost like last day of school before the holidays. Everybody was quite excited. We said, look, take the monitors, take the keyboards, take all that stuff, and just go be productive at home. And I actually think it worked really well for us as a business, strangely. I think it was just, there was a sort of sense of, I don't know, everybody kind of pulled together. But I think now, goodness, we're 9 months later. I think you can see it's all starting to get a bit, whilst I don't think we'll ever be quite the way we were in the past, I think just being back in the office will be a good thing to be.
Well, it's interesting. I work with a lot of companies, a lot of startups especially, and I remember several of them prior to the COVID crisis having internal debates about to what extent is home working allowable and acceptable. My personal view is that it's kind of a no-brainer that it has to be in the mix if you want to enfranchise all of your people. But in other companies, that's not so clear cut. But all of the companies I spoke to reported to me that after they had moved to home working and forced home working with the lockdown, even despite the difficulties of having children around, that their general productivity had gone up, and they were very surprised about this. Now, I'm not proposing that therefore means we should continue that model, but I'm certain that these companies will reflect on that point and always have a significant element of home working in the mix going forward. So I think that day, you sent everyone home and we all did the same. I think there was a sense that we were ending a period of our society and starting another one, which would never look quite the same. And I think an element of that will be this recognition that home working isn't actually evil and unproductive and all those kind of fears and goblins that people conjure when this topic used to come up, but is in fact a necessary part of the mix. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but I'm certain it will be different.
Yeah, I agree completely. I remember I did a sort of session, and I think it was with the RBS. We was asked to kind of talk at a panel thing, and one of the guys there, and it's a phrase I've heard coined since about lockdown being the world's largest home working experiment. And I think, if you think of it like that, I think for certainly for proponents of home working, it's definitely been a success. Because I think for most organisations, certainly in the tech space, I think it was just a no-brainer. It was, one day we were in the office, the next day we weren't. And yes, certainly some of our customers, that wasn't quite true. But for the vast majority, it was like, was it the saying, necessity is the mother of invention? You know, people just had to do it, and there was no. What was the alternative? You closed your doors. No, and you couldn't have accepted huge drop-offs in productivity because businesses would have been in jeopardy then, and it was already going to be hard enough. So I think, yeah, I think it's certainly been worthwhile. And speaking from Incremental's point of view, I actually think we're in a stronger place now as a result of it. I think it's actually helped us as a business, which has been quite. At the time when we made the decision, I wasn't sure, but as it's transpired, yeah, it's worked quite well. But anyway, I mean, moving on slightly, Mark. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking back on was how we first met, and I was thinking about because you know at the time, so Gillian Docherty of the Data Lab, chief exec at the Data Lab. At the time, I was chair at the Data Lab, and we were looking to refresh the board and really kind of change things up a bit. And actually, certainly in the back of my head was that my time as chair of the Data Lab was coming to an end, that the organisation had kind of outgrew me as that founding chair and was moving on to a different place. So that was how I first sort of came into contact with you. But my question in that was what was it that got you interested enough to sort of get out your lovely West End pad and patter over to the Data Lab? What excited you about that?
Because I could see that was the direction of travel. That was what they were trying to do, and they were doing it really well. And I was keen to try to help a little bit if I could. They continue to go from strength to strength, and they've built a real sense of identity around data science in Scotland. And I think, ecosystems and communities need that sense of identity because that corresponds to a sense of confidence. And that's really important for all human endeavour, that we're confident enough to take a few risks, try a few things. So I really commend what you and Gillian started and what Gillian's continuing to do with her excellent team.
I mean, it was funny because I always felt every time we did anything with Data Lab, it was like pushing at an open door. Or I described it, I think, and maybe the first time we met, I might have described it as, setting it up. It was kind of like, you were chapping at people's doors, and every time they opened them, there was a party inside, and they were like, "Oh yeah, we really want to come on in. This is great." And it certainly felt as if there was a community that wanted to be brought together. It just so happened, I think, we got incredibly lucky with Gillian that we were able to bring on board someone who was able to sort of galvanise that and really give, I suppose, that community a kind of rallying point. And I suppose that was actually the whole point of the thing. The guys at Scottish Enterprise will probably kill me for saying that, but it felt to me before Data Lab existed that there was all these disparate things sort of just getting ready to start. And if somebody could just place a flag somewhere and say, here's a thing, coalesce around it, that might give a focal point to the community. And I think it's genuinely down to Gillian's, how can I put it? Just her hard graft, real super intelligence, and being able to get a great team behind her. And obviously, folk like yourself joining the board, that they were able to actually do that. Because I think, to be honest, having the idea of planting a flag is probably the dumbest and simplest idea I think anybody could ever have. That was like that was about all I brought to the thing, if I'm honest, But it's been a terrific thing. But Mark, can I take you back a wee bit further then? Because I didn't know really that much about your background at all in terms of so by the time you were at Data Lab, or I was trying to convince you to join the board at Data Lab, the Skyscanner thing had happened, and then I knew of you from that. But can you kind of take me back a bit and give us a bit of a potted history to how did your career span from when you left uni?
Yeah, sure. So I started my first proper job, I guess you could call it, in BT's research labs as a software engineer, and After a few years there was always a pressure in the sort of larger organisations to move into management after a few years if you were doing quite well. But at that point, I was still very much felt I was learning to be a software engineer. So I saw an advert, a very sort of dodgy, badly formatted advert for a small tech company out in Cumbernauld called Incremental, which turned out to be David Sybil's first startup. Yeah. And so I joined there. I think it was one of the first 10 people there, and that was my introduction to the startup world. I was enthralled with David's vision. I'd never heard someone in Scotland talk that confidently about the impact we could make, and that for all of us young guys that joined the team there, that was a very exciting time, and we grew that company.
Sorry, Mark, what age was David at that point?
Oh, I'm not sure, be late 30s, early 40s, something like that.
Right. Okay.
But we grew that company. I ended up as the VP of engineering there. We grew to about 150 people, and we sold to Cisco in the year 2000. So that was an extraordinary journey, and I think everything that I did afterwards came from the amazing learning experience that Adlantech was. All of our customers were in the US, a lot of them in the Silicon Valley. So we were in the US all the time, learning that tech culture, etc. And almost all the mistakes I made served me really well later on because I reflected on what I should have done and later. So I stayed there for a long time. I guess it was 5 years I was there, and then we were acquired by Cisco. So I was the director in Cisco for a couple of years, and then I left there to start Sumerian with David. So that was another startup. That was when big data wasn't really a thing. We were a big data startup, and that went reasonably well. I stayed there. I think I stayed there too long, actually.
How come? What makes you think of that?
Because I think at some point we probably lost our way a little bit. Well, we did lose our way a bit as a company, and it was an environment where I'd stopped learning, and I think I got frustrated in that environment. And I've since learned that it's always better to leave somewhere while it's still painful to leave it. It's still difficult because you still want to do things. Because I think everything is a natural start and a natural end, and if you stay somewhere a little bit too far past that natural end, it starts to not feel good. So that was a lesson learned there. But the company, continued in business and eventually sold sometime later. So, but it wasn't the same success that Adlantech had been. After that, I ended up back in Cisco in a different role as a global delivery director for Cisco, and it was interesting. I'd been a director in Cisco when I was 29, and I think I was one of the youngest 2 or 3 directors they had in the company then. And then I was a director again 10 years later, basically. And, it was very striking how much more comfortable I was the second time round, because I'd learned so much more about how to get things done, how to influence people, how to organise, and how to manage the politics that inevitably come in these kind of environments. So it was an interesting contrast. But then I'd gotten to know Gareth Williams, who was the CEO of Skyscanner at the time, a small community here, and I used to advise him on, informally advise him on, the sort of scaling issues that he was coming across. So he asked me to join the business, and I was reluctant to do so at the time because I was really enjoying being in Cisco. It was going very well. And Skyscanner was at that stage where a lot of startups get to, where the product's good, but the organisation isn't good. It's not, the founders have never tried to grow a company beyond a small size, and there's organisational challenges and so on. Yeah. And at the time, Skyscanner had a reputation for a place that senior folks didn't, if they joined, they didn't stay that long, which is very common with startups where they struggle to inculcate new management talents into the original team. So I was a little bit unsure, but I eventually one day woke up, just realised that I was being silly, and the opportunity that had been created by Gareth and his colleagues, and the opportunity we had to make a huge impact in the world if we could sort out some of these problems, I thought was a great thing to try and do. So I left Cisco, joined Skyscanner, and after that, the rest is recent history, I guess.
So what sort of size was Skyscanner, and when was this? What was this,
Uh,
like 2012 or something?
yeah, this was early. I was talking to Gareth about joining in 2011 and joined in early
Right.
2012. And the company was about 90 people at the time, so still pretty small.
Yeah.
And when I left Skyscanner, we'd grown to just under 1,000 people. So we went through a lot of growth over those 5 years. But yeah, that's where we were at that time.
Yeah, it's funny because at the time I I'm trying to think back. So 2012, I'm trying to get, yeah. So 2012, a more group was just on the go. I
Mhm.
think we were, so the sort of management buyout had happened. You know, there had been the real-time engineering business, which was Jerry Docherty's business that I joined. I joined as a graduate, and that business had been subsumed into Sword, which was Jacques Markey, French multinational, run by this guy Jacques Matardi, a nice guy, but he'd quite an interesting business model. And the Sword model for services companies certainly was this sort of, buy, owner, manage businesses, bring them into the fold, and you can grow them as a collective, and then you've always got the opportunity to sell them off as individual bits again. And that's kind of what happened to create the Amore thing. But yeah, back then, the Amore story, I think we were about 200 or something. And at the time, I was just was a kind of senior developer, techie, within the business. But I remember as Skyscanner grew, we lost, some of our best engineers over to you guys. I
Thank
remember at the time, one guy in particular who had joined us as a graduate, who was a terrific engineer. Uh, I'll name check him here, Stephen Haley, and Stevie had joined us, young boy, one of the cleverest guys I met, super hard working. And I remember when he'd said he was moving over, and I was like, this bloody Skyscanner. You see, at that point, you were on my hit list, quite literally. So the Skyscanner, the Sky Scanner story is one I'm always interested in, because it was such a big growth story over quite a short period of time,
you.
and I think that kind of gave rise to it being this sort of, I suppose, poster child, quite rightly, I think, as well. This kind of poster child for the tech sector. What being part of that, and I've heard various people uh, pay you huge compliments as I've kind of asked about you and your impact on that. But being part of that, what what did you take away from that journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in some ways, it was a continuation of what I'd taken from the Atlantic experience. When a company's growing very rapidly, you find yourself essentially, it's a bit of a simplification, but in almost a different company every 6 months. You do take some things through, of course, but it's in terms of how you operate, how you're organised, how you lead as a leader, it's different because the scale is different. And so many companies flounder on that point. I think startups fail either because the product wasn't right for the market, which is kind of obvious. But so many others, when the product is right for the market, they still fail. They still fail to scale when they could have done because the organization doesn't work or the leadership team scaled out. So what you're very conscious of in a company growing at that speed is the necessity of reinventing yourself every few months, and that requires you to be frantically educating yourself on how does a company work at the next level of scale, and how do I work within that at the next level of scale. So it's kind of a journey where on the outside, people look at Skyscanner's graphs and that period of kind of up and to the right graphs, exponential growth, and it all looks very smooth. But I remember in the inside, we were all, bloody terrified most of the time internally. We didn't show that to our teams, obviously, but it was every day was another step into the unknown. And I've since learned that success is actually more frightening than the word failure. I hate the word failure. It's not a good description. But if something doesn't work, then you're where you were yesterday. If something does work and you're required to change everything to keep it working, and then it works at an ever greater scale, and you're required to change everything again, every day is difficult because you're worried you're going to break this thing. You're worried you don't have the experience to take it to the next level. So it was a very, very intensive growth period. But I learned a tremendous amount about people, about myself, about teams, about processes. So I don't regret a day of that. But anyone who ever gives you an impression, and you'll know this as well, Neil, from your own experience of growing companies, that it's all kind of straightforward and everyone knows what they're doing. There's a lot of retrospective stories about Skyscanner's growth, but the truth is, day by day, it was an exhilarating and terrifying ride in all my days there.
It's funny you put it like that, because I think Incremental's been a similar journey, and we've made a few missteps. Certainly maybe not. This year's been a great year for us. Last year, yeah, a few missteps. I think a few mistakes that I'd made, and we as a business collectively made. But if I wind it back to my time at Amor, where I was CTO, sat on the board there, I think again that when you look back at that story of growth from that business, when the management buyout happened, that business had gone from, I want to say, 200, 250 people. By the time the exit came to Lockheed, it was about 700. There had been tremendous growth, and just like you describe, I think the big thing for me to witness, it was that sort of sense of not quite a disorganized terror, but certainly a sense of, this isn't straightforward. This requires a lot of work, and you make mistakes. And probably the thing that Amor did better than any other organisation that I've been part of since, and I include Incremental in this, is it was very quick to move on from mistakes. And I've since read a few things about startups and such like, and that ability to sort of almost get over your mistake fast and not beat yourself up about it, just move on, continue down a path that you know to be wrong because you've got this far. Just look at it and say, is this right? Isn't it? If not, make the course correction. Amor was tremendous at that, and I think a big part of that was down to the leaders that were there.
Yeah, I think that you touched on a very important point, that what we realised is there's a fundamental principle that I think the American Air Force first kind of wrote down, which was that speed of iteration always wins against quality of iteration, and that came from them analysing why in the 1950s the American fighter planes tended to win against the Russian-built fighter planes, even though the Russian fighter planes were faster and more powerful and just better armed and so on. And they eventually traced it to the fact that the American fighter planes had a hydraulic gear stick, so the pilots could turn the plane around without getting fatigued, whereas after 4 or 5 turns on a Russian plane, the non-hydraulic gear stick meant that the pilots got fatigued. So they eventually netted that out at speed of iteration beats quality of iteration. And this is a principle of Agile, a much misused term, but I find in Skyscanner, if we were doing the wrong thing, and you said you made a few missteps, and we made lots and lots of missteps, but provided you can iterate away from those quickly, that's okay. When I joined Skyscanner, I was struck by, at that time, we really struggled to release software. It took us 6 weeks to do a major software release and 2 weeks to fix it. And there was tons of things that the founders wanted to build, as is always the case. And because we couldn't build software anymore, we couldn't get hard stuff done at speed, the company had become world-class at arguing with each other about what we should do. And you'll see this, it's very common. I'm not picking on Skyscanner, but it's very common that if you can't iterate quickly, you can always tell that when you walk into a room, because you can see how well people argue about the priority list, because they become very good at that instead. It's a displacement activity. So we put a lot of work into iterating quickly. So we went from releasing software every 6 weeks to doing dozens of releases a day in the end. And that meant that, and I'm simplifying again, that it's a bit like, if you want to get out of town and there's one ferry every 3 months, then you and I are going to argue for a long time who's on that ferry. If there's one every 15 minutes, I'll say, Neil, go ahead, you take that one, I'll get the next one. So the amount of time you spend speculating reduces because you can do stuff and try stuff. That required an enormous investment in tooling and in culture and in attitude and knowledge. But I saw when I looked at our performance vis-a-vis our competitors that we started to really break away in proportion to our speed of iteration.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think I'm always struck actually by how influential that whole sort of agile software engineering mindset has been on pretty much every aspect of my life, from the point at which it kind of became a thing. So I mean, I graduated, so I'm a wee bit younger than you. So I graduated in '98. And when I first came out, it was like, it was still all waterfall. It was still all big upfront design. It was all that sort of thing. And then because at that time, the business I was in and what I did as a software engineer, we tend to be delivering systems that took you 3 to 6 months, start to finish. So from design, implementation, test, deploy, and then into support. 6 months was a long one, right? But what you found was you kind of got better with every one that you did. So it was quite an interesting cycle you get into. And then I want to say it was about maybe 2001, 2001, and there was 2 books that were floating about, and I've still got. That's why I'm looking at my bookshelf here. The first one was Martin Fowler's book, Refactoring. The kind of beigey one with the red line on it. That book had come out, and then there was a few others that had started being really influential in terms of kind of that what became the Agile Manifesto and all the rest of it. But I was always struck by that sense of iterative to anything that you do, the speed of execution, your ability to formulate something, to deliver it, evaluate it, and then course correct if you needed to, and get that loop going really fast. And ever since that point, I've always, I've seen various things in business literature about, things like the flywheel idea or the whole fail fast type thing. It seems that kind of idea in terms of software delivery has ended up being massively influential right across the business sphere. And I was always really struck by that I was incredibly lucky to be involved in software engineering at a time when that sort of was becoming a thing, and how much I've seen it sort of. Maybe it's confirmation bias, right enough, but I do see it in a lot of different places. It's been a thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think to generalize that, a thing I learned in my career is it's very important to look outside your domain and learn from other domains. So we've just given an example there where we can, use agile techniques that were championed in software and apply them to business in general. But of course, earlier I was talking about how that idea itself was derived from a military background. Another great example is, often we struggle to improve our software processes. Why are we slowing down our bug fixing, or why can't we get features built? And we try all sorts of stuff. But when I started studying manufacturing techniques and manufacturing optimization, things like the theory of constraints or the Toyota way, those kind of things, and applied those to my software processes, it was tremendously beneficial in terms of going faster. So I think it's very important that we try to get out of our local, domain and learn from others, because you tend to find Like, for example, manufacturing optimization techniques are 30 years ahead of most software processes, but we're all too sophisticated as software engineers to bother ourselves with an assembly line technique, and then it turns out we're the fools. One other comment I'd add, on the Agile side is a lot of people deploy Agile principles and then wonder why everything just got slower. And it's a very common problem. I see the same problem where people deploy OKRs and then wonder why everything got harder, because they dread somewhere that the opposite would happen. And I think the mistake we often make is, let's take Agile, for example. Let's imagine you've got an organization that's not working, that it's not moving at speed. If you adopt Agile, but what you're actually doing is adopting the trappings of Agile, adopting the terminology and the ceremonies, having stand-ups and all that kind of stuff, and sprints. What you're really often doing is taking something that's pretty slow, an engine that's broken, and you're layering on top of it yet more structure and bureaucracy, and then you wonder why things go more slowly. So I've always found it very important to try to get to the underlying fundamental principles of what does this thing try to achieve, and then work back out from there. So, for example, Agile has a lot to do with speed of iteration and making an organization be able to iterate quickly. That doesn't necessarily require some of the ceremonies that have been encoded into Agile, but often people don't start at the fundamentals and start at the trappings, and that's where they tend to go wrong.
Yeah, they work their way back in from the outside.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they look at it. Yeah, I remember it was funny because, again, I think that was a great benefit, because I don't think I would have got that had I come to it later. But I think because of the timing of it, there was certain things that the organisation I was part of at the time was doing that then it just so happened, we had to do it to do something faster. So automated testing being the first one. And I remember writing C++ console programs because the ActionIt framework and the GUIs for ActionIt hadn't been developed at that point. So we wrote these console programs, and we made every stupid ass mistake in the book. So the tests had to run in a specific order. You couldn't run one test in isolation. The tests, rather than just saying they'd passed or failed, would give you an answer. So you'd be sitting there with your notebook going, 452. Is that right? Is it supposed to be 400? All that sort of stuff. But it meant you got to build it up from the bottom up, and you got to see, exactly as you say, that Agile became this cult where the ceremony was far more important than the fundamental base thing, which is produce working software quickly. Make sure it's the right sort. Make sure the customer can see it, can engage with it, because that's the way that you truly determine that. I'm trying to remember if this was a thing that the Agile Manifesto guys come out with, but this idea that nothing beats working software as a measure of progress. It's like, you can show me Gantt charts till the cows come home, but actually give me the thing, let me see it. Because the way that people engage with that, it changes their mindset about what their next set of requirements are going to be and all that. I think, I think I was incredibly fortunate. The timing I got that education meant that I didn't have to come back in from the outside. So yeah, definitely. So you can finish up at Skyscanner. You're then kind of, by that point, you're a bit of a celeb in the Scottish tech world. So you start getting involved, obviously with Data Lab at that point, and some startups. But how does that then lead on to the Logan review? How or the Logan report, or as it's called in my household, the other Logan report? So how do you go from doing those kinds of things to being asked by the Scottish Government to get involved and start giving them some help?
Sure. Well, when I after we sold the company to C-Trip, I was tired, and I didn't want to do another 3 to 5 years of 24/7 COOing in Skyscanner or anywhere else by that point. So I wanted to change, and I had spent my career in Scotland, as you and others have too, quite often being told that you can't grow a big successful tech company here in a region. You have to be in London or Silicon Valley, etc., etc. And I'd always enjoyed being part of teams that had challenged that view and sometimes proved that wrong. So when I left Skyscanner, what I knew I wanted to do was contribute to our ecosystem here in Scotland. I think it's important in a small country that we all try and do our bit to help the country as a whole, if we can. And I decided to do that by doing a number of things. The first was I invested in a few startups, and the second thing was I joined the board of a few, and also Data Lab, which was a sort of different organisation. And I spent about a year doing very intensive advisory work for many others. But I started lobbying at Glasgow University's Computing Science School to see if we could create a course where we could teach students how to be entrepreneurial, tech students how to be entrepreneurial, because I wanted to try and demonstrate more widely in Scotland that that's an essential part of a tech undergraduate's experience, and would really benefit our ecosystem if it became standardised. So I eventually became a professor at the School of Computing Science, which I'm still doing, and teaching a course to fourth years there. But at the same time, I authored an early, very, very early, simple version of what became the Ecosystem Review, and sort of hawked that around those few government people that I knew. And that was about 2.5 years ago. I didn't hear more about it, and that was okay. But I returned to the subject in my inaugural lecture as a professor, which is a kind of ceremonial thing. And some of the Scottish Government representatives were at that, and they came and asked me if I would work with Kate Forbes on developing something a little bit more substantial. And then COVID happened, so that conversation temporarily got parked, but it came back in May. And at that point, I was watching nurses and doctors and pharmacists and all those people risking their lives, frankly, to look after others. I was looking at the folks in Sainsbury's serving me, risking their lives to some extent, or their health at least. And I was thinking, I'm a sort of semi-retired IT guy, and I'm not doing anything here. And I didn't feel good about it. So when Kate Forbes had called me to discuss this, I was actually delighted to be able to do something. It's not quite the same, but at least it was something, and I felt useful for a period of time for my kind of fellow citizens. So that's where that came from. And what's been really nice to see is that my view is that anybody who'd spent some time in the ecosystem and industry would write a very, very similar report with very similar findings. That's not the hard bit. What's actually been very gratifying is that, and this isn't a political point, but the Scottish Government has, and Kate Forbes in particular, has very wholeheartedly embraced the principles and the ideas in the review. And I think that gives us a fighting chance of actually doing something, because there's real energy from industry, there's energy from government, and it's not always been the case that we've managed to get those two stars to align. So that's been really encouraging, and my intention is to, insofar as I do have a day job, as much time as I can spend on this, I'm going to try and help that process as we go forward.
I think it's interesting you say that about Kate Forbes in particular, and again, this is not a political viewpoint, but when we were right away at the start of Data Lab, I think there was I was quite struck actually by there was various ministers who kind of got involved in what was the Innovation Centre programme more broadly. And the Innovation Centre programme, I always thought was a tremendously clever thing that they were setting out to do. A few things kind of got in the way of it, which I think has hurt the programme.
Mm-hmm.
But in its essence, there was a sense that there are big problems to solve, or there are big opportunities, is maybe a better way of putting it, and they kind of asked for help. Essentially they said, look, there's big opportunities. We don't have all the answers as government. Please come and tell us for a way that you, as your community, think that you should do something. And so Data Lab had its structure, and it was very different from some others, and we get quite a bit of flack actually during the initial review. So, we were proposing a 3-hub model, and that really wasn't popular. It was like, why are you wasting money being located in these different locations? There was lots of that chat, but they let it happen. And so you ended up with these, very different shaped things. Some of them have worked really well, some of them have worked less so. But they were always prepared, I think, to take a punt. They were going to, let's see, let's listen. And in particular, I think for the innovation centres at that point, it was John Swinney, who I think was pretty instrumental, and I think kind of encouraging that attitude of take a punt. Now, that to be fair to Scottish Enterprise, to the Scottish Funding Council as well, there was great people in both those organisations. But I think what you've found, I certainly found, albeit in a much smaller way, with Data Lab, was that there was a genuine sense of interest in what people from whatever that community was had to say, and a desire to help, which maybe I had an incorrect view, or some sort of I don't know, what's the word? Kind of twisted view of what politicians were like. But that a cynic's view. Maybe I had a cynicism about it, but that wasn't my experience at all. If anything, it was the exact opposite.
Apologies for the noise there.
That's right.
I agree with that. I learned before I was, a part-time academic. I used to think it must be very easy to be an academic, and I learned it's actually extremely difficult. Before I started working closely or more closely with politicians, you think these jobs are one thing, but then it turns out they're another. And government is difficult. It's a difficult thing to do, and no one thanks you for your successes, but they point out your failures pretty aggressively. So I've got a lot of sympathy and empathy for what they're trying to do. I've been extremely impressed with Kate Forbes. She's a star in our firmament, and what's particularly impressed me is that she really has taken the time, in a way that isn't always the case with politicians in other areas, to understand the digital sector, which is really put in the shoe leather, as they say, to go find out. And that means that when something like the ecosystem review gets published, she really gets it. And I'd say also her civil service team is in a very similar stance. They've really taken the time to get to know this industry. So that's tremendously encouraging. And I think, Neil, that is our size as a country a strength or a weakness? I think it depends how you want to look at it. It ought to be a strength, because we ought to be able to get things done more easily because we're smaller. There's less people to consult, less people to draw consensus from. So the innovation centres is an example of that. And I really hope that the recommendations in the review are another example of that. But it's really helpful and really important to have senior ministerial energy behind these type of things, and we absolutely have that. And I hope that we don't squander that opportunity, and I'm certainly going to do my best to make sure that I'm not part of any squandering. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think it's funny. The thing that struck me as you were talking there was that there's a phrase I think's become cliche now, but I think it holds true about, and it's used for businesses, but I think it's equally applicable to countries. About, it's no longer about big versus small, it's fast versus slow. And I actually think when I think about the opportunity for any nation, regardless of its scale, it's about how quick you can get after things. Really, nowadays is actually the issue. But let's talk about the review itself. So what? I suppose what was your overarching aim for the review? What was your big thrust that you wanted to put forward?
So I think there's a couple of main things. First of all, I wanted to establish a terminology and a model for what we mean by our tech ecosystem, because as you'll know, that's a phrase that's often used, but we all, prior to this point, mean different things by it. Now that's a big problem, because we've got no shortage of agencies in Scotland and institutions, but if we all believe the problem is a different problem and a different model, it's very unlikely we're going to make progress. Sometimes we're actually making contradictory interventions. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to achieve was that we all coalesced around a common model of the tech ecosystem. What is it, and what does it mean when we say we want to improve it? Yeah. And that's a precursor to any improvements. I think the second thing I wanted to get across is that we need to move away from any institutional parochialism and move towards making interventions that benefit the output of that tech ecosystem, and that's the only criteria that should matter. So, for example, it's very easy for universities or Scottish enterprise or government bodies and so on and so forth, or industry, to do things that are locally convenient. Fits their KPIs, all that kind of stuff. And we've got to move away from that. So I wanted to make that point. I'll give you a concrete example of that. Yeah. One of the recommendations in the report is that we treat computing science as a peer of mathematics at school level, or mathematics or physics. Now, that's undoubtedly difficult. It's not just inconvenient for many agencies to instantiate that, it's actually very difficult. So therefore, all things being equal, we'd never bother trying, and we never have tried. But if you put that in the context of the future supply of young, talented, energetic, enthusiastic engineers into our ecosystem, then it becomes obvious that that's the direction of travel. So that's really important. And I also wanted to make sure that, very related to that our agencies and institutions started to move towards a model where we didn't assess our interventions based on very simplistic non-system measures. So, for example, let's take something like Codebase or Turing Fest. Now, historically, those two institutions, and there are others, have struggled to get public funding support for what they're doing because their P&L breaks even, let's say. Mm-hmm. But if you consider, for example, the enormous value that a Codebase or a Turing Fest injects into the ecosystem, but the problem for them is that that value manifests months or years later and doesn't get attributed to them, then you can see that assessing these kind of constructs on their local P&Ls today is very, very short-sighted, but that's how Scotland works today. So I wanted to get a different way of thinking about the ecosystem along those lines, and if we could establish that, then the specific recommendations would become far better contexted and a much better chance of being implemented. So that was my key goal at the outset.
I mean, the thing that struck me about it when I first read it was, I can't remember how early in the report it is, but essentially you set down to define what will henceforth be called as tech. Mm-hmm. And I'll be honest, when I looked at it, I said, that's not tech. It's part of it, mm-hmm. but it's not the full breadth of it. What was behind the thought process to have that? What for me, when I looked at it, was this is a very distinct type of software product business. What was behind that thought process about focusing there?
No, I'm glad you asked me that question. There's a number of things behind it. And I, right at the outset, I'll acknowledge it's a narrow definition, but that was a conscious choice, and I'll try and explain why that was. I was very conscious that, most reports, most government reports, suffer from an overgeneralization problem. They survey the entire landscape, and because they do that, the task becomes unwieldy. So the recommendations they make often are too general or too diluted to be implementable, and that frankly lets everyone off the hook. So what you end up is recommendations to have talks about talks, or to form a committee who will pick the members of a committee who will have talks about talks. And there's always a risk of that in any government anywhere's methodologies. So I wanted to, at the risk of creating new problems, I wanted to take a different approach. And the approach I decided to take was define a relatively narrow field that would, the plus of that would allow me to make very specific recommendations. And my calculation was that if that was a successful exercise, then the report is almost written like a template. It's like this is what I'm going to address as tech, and this is the template we can induce from that example that we can then apply in other areas. So that was my general thinking. And the final consideration was that in almost all flavors of tech, software is more and more dominant. You'll have heard the famous phrase from Mark Anderson, software is eating the world. So in what we traditionally think of as hardware businesses, they're really software businesses, and so on. So I thought that, with all those things considered, I would make my camp on that grounds. And, I'm hoping that I try to, when I discuss the report nowadays, I try to emphasize the templatization. If this works here, it's going to work there too. But I recognize, the criticism is perfectly valid. I just think with these kind of things, you can't please all audiences, or you end up pleasing none. So I would go specific and move out from there.
Yeah, and I think that's a very wise choice. Because I think you're spot on in that. Yeah, too many things have been so wide-ranging that two things happen. I think one is that I think by and large, when people see a review, when it's vague, they always think the best of it. So if I think about Incremental and indeed the More Group, and even back to my time at Realtime, those businesses for me they're not tech businesses as you define them in this, right? So they weren't software product businesses. What they actually were was some variant of a professional services business. That's actually what they were. They provide consultancy services, but rather than being in accounts or legal advice, whatever the other ones are, a PwC or a Bernese Paul or a BDO or something like that. Rather than those sorts of businesses, the stuff that they consulted on was software and software product and software approaches and delivery and stuff. And for a software engineer, that's a great place to be. You get big variety and whatever, but it's a different type of business. And I think what we'd seen what I'd seen in the past from government things, I mean, there was something the UK government did, I want to say right back, like maybe around about the millennium, and there was this wacky thing that sort of happened where they had a strategy for creative industries, and somewhere software had ended up heaped in with that. And I think that I'm pretty sure there's still parts of the sort of government classification of industries are at least jobs where it's kind of heaped in with other creative industries. And as a result, when they were unveiling strategies for the creative industries, it was kind of like it was so vague, but people wanted to believe that this was something good. And so what inevitably happened was you had these quite broad reports that everybody got quite excited about, but then of course they were so broad that you couldn't actually satisfy everybody, and then everybody got really disappointed and nothing ever happened. And so I think that being able to narrow it down, regardless of the terminology used, but being focused on a specific area, you've got much more chance, I think, of pleasing a set of people and having an outcome that I think is positive.
Yeah, I also think that, I use the term in the report that this isn't so much a definition as a centre of gravity. And what I mean by that is that all of these things you just described are on a continuum. There's an infinitesimal difference between a high-tech software business and a high-tech hardware business today, and so on. So I wanted to create, let's not get hung up in definition. Let's get a centre of gravity that describes how these companies tend to work, and then I believe if we implement the requirements, or the recommendations rather, in the report, that all adjacent businesses in that landscape will also receive a lot of benefit. So that's my logic. I think the other challenge I had was, in Scotland we talk a lot about digital skills. Now, there's a spectrum, of course, as you'll know very well. And at one end of that is the very noble and worthwhile and extremely necessary task of making sure that all of our citizens are enfranchised. People can basically use internet, and that's extremely important. I don't deny that for a second. At the other end of that spectrum is high-tech, software business, native software businesses building software products, and in the middle are most, or many businesses, not most, that benefit from digital literacy at the company level. So we've got individual literacy, company literacy, and native digital. And we need an approach to all of those. But very often in Scotland, we conflate, especially in the political landscape, we conflate digital skills with meaning, can I use Microsoft Office and things like that. So I wanted to lead with a very kind of tight statement that whatever you think you're reading here, it's over here, it's not over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
But recognizing it's a spectrum, so that was my logic.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. So let's, so looking at the report at a high level, I can take away, three main pillars from it: the piece around education, the piece around infrastructure, and the piece around funding, finance, that kind of thing. The thing I'm interested in getting your views on, first of all, is this piece around education. And earlier on, when we were talking, you spoke about, this mindset shift right across the board from an education perspective of computing science, or let's say computational thinking, whatever way we want to word that, being a par with the traditional reading, writing, arithmetic sort of level, and that being an uncomfortable truth for many. But just, I suppose, when you talk about that in the report, how, at your core, how far do you think that needs to shift from where we are today? How big a shift do you think we need to make as a country to get after that bit, to really fix that problem?
Well, let's look at where we are today. So today we largely start teaching computing science formally in third year at school as an option. We have a falling number of students every year in the subject over the last 10 years. The number of teachers in the subject is falling over the last 10 years. So we're going backwards at the moment in our provision of future potential computing scientists. It's not the only route into that profession, but it isn't a good start when we have that problem. Where I think we should be, I think we should be teaching the pedagogy of computing from primary school, so that children are digitally native, and programming computers is a natural thing to do by the time they get to secondary school. So that's where I think we need to go. I also think we need to do that because by the time you get to higher level at school, at secondary school, you've got a participation rate amongst girls of only 16%. And that's because our society has long before explained to girls why this is a boys' subject. These are boys' toys. And I think we've got a more fighting chance of addressing that if we're teaching our girls and boys from age 5, age 6.
See that gender thing, Mark? I mean, that was certainly true when I was coming through. So when I was at university, I think in my course there was there was a handful of girls out of maybe, I don't know, that started first year, maybe 70, so it was less than 10% were girls. But that wasn't the way it was a way back at the start of when computing was first becoming a thing. What happened during the 60s and 70s that by the time you get to the 80s and then the 90s when I was there and yourself as well, what happened? Because it never used to be like that.
Yeah, I think two main things happened, Neil, and it's interesting. It's a very interesting point because when the profession of software engineering started back in the mid 40s, 100% of programmers were women.
Yeah.
Now, if you follow that journey, why was that the case? Well, back then, as you'll know, well, not because you were there, but you'll know about that. The hardware was big and complicated and filled rooms, made noises, flashing lights. This was man's work. And programming the computers was difficult, but it was also laborious. So that was deemed to be secretarial work. So we gave that to the women in the universities. And turned out they were really, really good at it. And actually, the early programming pioneers of that time defined most of the constructs and ideas that we still use today. And they were so successful that the software became the cool thing and the hardware became commoditized. So then, of course, men started to move into the profession, which is, of course, fine. But you couldn't have that profession defined as a secretarial task if men are moving in. So the salaries went up and it got redefined as the cognitively challenging discipline that it is. But, of course, then with the prejudices of the day, as we get into the kind of 60s and beyond now, everybody knew that men were better at cognitive tasks than women. They just completely disregarded the prior evidence. So it started to be that women didn't get hired. So that started the problem. But then in the 1980s, a really interesting thing happened where the participation rates, if you look at the charts of participation rates of young women in university undergraduate courses, round about the late 1980s, especially at tanks. And that coincides with the launch of the home computer, but offset by a few years. And the general belief as to why that happened was that we marketed home computers as a boy's toy, and we got the consequences of that. So what it tells you, the positive I take out of that is that this is all societal conditioning, and we have a choice. And I like the fact we're a small country. We could actually lead on this. We have a choice of reversing that conditioning, changing that conditioning. And I really, really think we should, because what we're doing is, first of all, as a so-called civilized society, we're denying opportunity in a great profession to half of our people. And as an economy, we're taking half of our best people out of that profession. And that just seems, in both points, absurd.
Yeah, it's bonkers, absolutely bonkers. It's been one of these things that's been kicked around. Well, there's two things I suppose have been kicked around. One has been the gender thing, right? And interesting to hear your kind of analysis of that, because yeah, certainly a fair bit of what you said there I wasn't aware of. But the other thing that I've been kind of struck with, and maybe this is because I'm a little bit myopic in this topic in particular, has been the number of people overall who've been taking this as a subject, and specifically, I was looking at how many Scottish kids are going on to do computing science at university. A very narrow band of what computing is, but just looking at it and seeing, right, how many kids are we getting through? And is every kid that wants to do this, who is academically capable of doing it, are they getting the chance to do it? And when I looked at that question, the answer wasn't a resounding yes. So it wasn't clear to me that every kid that had the aptitude to do it and wanted to do it, there was space available for them to do it. And so one of the things that when I was speaking to Sir Jim MacDonald at Strathclyde, who I know you know as well, one of the things that I've started chipping away at is, why are we not increasing just the the basic numbers of computing science places at university level. But why is that number not 10 times? Because there's a strange set of rules or KPIs that kind of start infecting universities, which is right. They need to somehow demonstrate their value. But I'm always struck by that it doesn't seem obvious to me that, the how can I put this? Right now, I think if we turn on all the taps and we see this thing coming through, we're going to have this massive problem at universities. Because right now, with the taps turned off, I don't think the universities are geared up to take as many kids as they as I think want to be doing this subject. Even with all the gender bias things going on, how do you think the universities are geared up for that? Is that a fair view I've got of it, or do you think, no, we need to turn it on and then we'll turn on the taps as we go? Because I've got some terrifying notion in my head that you actually need to work this backwards. Because if we don't turn the universities up right now, then it doesn't matter. Because we're pinched at every single point along the way. So open up the first one first.
Yeah, well, you've got to really look at it as a pipeline, and we've currently got falling participation at school level. So the problem we're going to have in the near term isn't the number of places or universities, because the supply is actually declining. So I think we've got to look at it end to end. In my experience, the universities are very good at scaling up when they have to. They're large scale organisations. They have up to 30,000 students nowadays. If I think about my own university, when I was there at 10,000 students, now got 30,000. So they scale up pretty effectively. But it's at school level where we've got the supply problem. And a lot of kids report anecdotally that they took computing science, but once they finished the course, they didn't like the subject anymore. So we're teaching it in a way that isn't working. So we've got to address that kind of problem. A lot of parents don't understand the subject. It's not the ones that they knew about at school, so they don't encourage their children to do it. We've got to address that problem. So you've got to go right back. And I think relatively speaking, the easier part will be the universities. I know, for example, that several of our universities have doubled the number of computing science places they have over just the last few years, and that's quite impressive. But they haven't filled them with Scottish students because the supply isn't there in the quality that they need.
That's interesting. It's certainly when I went digging at that very question, it wasn't entirely obvious to me that was the case. But yeah, I mean, I take the point that they can scale up when they want to, and I think that's the trick for me, I suppose, is that there seems to be a kind of reticence to it, and I was never sure what it was. But one of a friend of mine was reasonably senior with a big legal practice in Glasgow, and one of the things he's explaining to me, this is going back maybe 3 years ago now, and he was explaining that the number of junior solicitors that they had taken on that previous year was a fraction of what they'd taken on, say, 10 years prior. Their business was bigger, but the recruitment of junior solicitors, so you're talking, grade A students throughout their academic careers to get to this level, and there just weren't the jobs for them. And again, I go back to various things that have happened at the Scottish Government level about making STEM subjects more interesting more broadly, never mind computing science, but trying to say to people that perhaps the traditional professions perhaps don't have as much guaranteed success financially for your kids as they once did. It was a real, when he gave the numbers, and I won't share the organisation's name, but it literally was, Mark, it was an order of magnitude different. And it was shocking, and you're thinking, but these law courses, they were still as well populated. You know, they were still the same size because university was still getting the same sort of feed to it. And I was really struck by again, we spoke earlier on about agility and fleet of footness. It was like, oh goodness, we've got all these really talented young people entering the workforce, but it feels like the jobs market shifted underneath them, and through no fault of their own, they're ill-equipped for it.
Yeah, I think that's very true. You know, I think this country had a great engineering heritage, and somewhere along the line we decided that didn't matter so much, and what mattered was medicine, law, and accounting. And,
Yeah.
These are, you know, of course, very necessary and noble professions, but I think we've got to get our engineering chops back and celebrate the value and the fulfillment that comes with an engineering career. But you know, you mentioned, you know, the supply issue. About 12% of our children in this country don't have access to fast internet, or they don't have a computer at home, or their schools are in less advantaged areas and there's no computing science teacher there. You know, there's a lot of stuff we could be doing, and I think we are starting to do, to address this problem earlier in the funnel. We've also got to recognise that for universities, Scottish students aren't very lucrative, and that sets an upper cap. You know, you can charge a foreign student fee 4 times, 5 times as much sometimes as we do with Scottish students. So, you know, the universities are businesses at the end of the day, so you understand why that's a factor. I think that gives the Scottish Government options to encourage more Scottish students to be placed in our universities. So all of this is addressable, but you can see why, you know, back to my earlier comment, why this needs to be thought of at a system level, because what we're trying to do is optimize the flow of talent into our ecosystem. But if you take any one of these bits and breaks it out, yeah, it's a pain in the ass that we haven't got enough broadband coverage for our kids. What are we going to do about it? Well, that gets caught up in who pays for the broadband contract. These things are all solvable if you understand their importance in the context of the overall ecosystem.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of things I wanted to ask you just to kind of finish off. One was around about your thoughts, I suppose. We can get stuck in this education point a wee bit, but your thoughts around what you think the broader impact of that change will be, because you mentioned earlier on this idea about how can I put this, the broad spectrum of businesses. You've got these huge things in the middle, and I suppose what I see, in the report is you really need to be very focused to get the thing, and I totally get that. Do you think there's much benefit for the broader organisations though? Because hopefully a big part of what you're going to do here, or what this report's going to do, is start to fix the skill level of the people coming through more broadly into industry and into jobs. Do you think there's going to be? How do you think other businesses can benefit from this?
Well, what I'm going to say isn't guaranteed and automatic, but I hope that by generally improving the awareness and knowledge base of all students in the subject, that we'll see that all students being pupils and later stage, that in time in our society we'll see just a generally more digitally literate set of companies as well. There's a lot of things we can do in the near term. You know, the Data Lab's a great example of an organisation that's directly addressing the digital and data literacy of companies in that middle section today. But I do think there'll be adjacency benefits if we get really good at doing this right-hand side of the spectrum. We'll get pretty good just by osmosis at the middle, is what I believe. That's not guaranteed, though, and it does require some careful choices as we design these things. But I think we will generally raise the level of the digital sea in Scotland if we take actions that strengthen the tech ecosystem.
I mean, I think that's a thing that, if I think about Incremental and the businesses that we help, one of the things that I think is inevitable over the course of the next 5-10 years, I hope anyway, is that there's a greater sense that technologists can help every organisation Because I do think we're still in that place where organisations look, they don't think of themselves as being tech. They still don't have that bent to them. But I think more and more are going to start to see that over the coming years. And I think the inevitability of that means the sheer demand for people with the skills that we're talking about that are needed to help these tech software businesses grow are going to be needed more and more by all the companies that we have. Because if they don't have that, then I don't think they're going to be as successful as they need to be.
Yeah, no, I agree that's an important element. And is it an essential element? Well, businesses will still survive without it, but they'll do a lot better with it. So I agree with that.
Yeah. I mean, the other point I had was I'm always struck by this concept of the unicorn and the $1 billion businesses and valuation. When one of the criticisms that's going to put it, a focus on those is about how traditionally poor those businesses have been at wealth distribution. That if we take Instagram as an example, a huge valuation, but distributed around a relatively small number of people. When we look at the what we hope to see in tech unicorns, how do you think those can affect more broadly the economic well-being of the country?
Yeah, the first thing I'd say, Neil, is although the report mentions unicorns and at the far end of the funnel in the depictions of, for those that have seen that it has a unicorn depicted, I think there's sometimes a misreading of the report that it's about creating unicorns. It's not about creating unicorns. It's about creating an ecosystem that works. And it's about making sure that the companies can get as far into scale as they should have done, all things being equal, without impediments or missing pieces of our ecosystem. So if a company should have got to unicorn size in the Valley, it should be able to get to unicorn size in Scotland. If it should have got to mid-scale up size, if that was its natural destination, it should be able to do that in this ecosystem too, because all of those stages are enormously valuable. But today in our ecosystem, we don't have those luxuries of that kind of discussion because we have lots and lots of small startups and very few companies that get beyond that point. So that the report isn't about ecosystem, it isn't about unicorns. It's about the ecosystem and making sure that we allow our companies to get to their natural level. Now, on the question you asked me about wealth distribution, these are choices that companies can make. For example, in Skyscanner, 20% of the stock of the company was with its employees, and that was, 1,000 employees, give or take, that benefited very substantially, and in turn spent that money in the Scottish community. So, that was a founder's choice. Gareth, right at the start of Skyscanner, took the view that the staff should benefit significantly from any success, and I give him a huge amount of credit for making that decision and sticking to it over all those intervening years. So these are choices that companies have, but I'm less focused on unicorns and more focused on getting a critical mass of startups and scale-ups that are generally providing jobs and opportunity to our people. And then managers within those companies have got choices about how generous they are. I happen to think that the more you enfranchise your team in ownership in the company, the more energy gets directed towards the company's goals, and it's a simple equation. So I think from my point of view, it's an obvious thing to do, but it's not obvious to every company, I guess.
So if I think about the unicorn element to it, having unicorns is a natural side effect of a healthy ecosystem.
Yes, it is, and even not having any unicorns and just having lots of successful companies that are sustainable is also there's different ways you can define success, but a natural side effect of a successful ecosystem is some of those companies will get to scale and you can stick a label on them. Interestingly, in Skyscanner, we never used the term unicorn. We didn't celebrate it as a thing because it's just a tag. What we try to do is have a business that was sustainable and successful as much as it could be. But yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a natural byproduct of a generally healthy ecosystem.
Well, look, I mean, I'm conscious we've been talking for quite a while. I think, for what it's worth, for little as my opinion is worth, I think the report does, it fills a gap that I think was badly needed filled in terms of the country and this part of the economy. My genuine hope is that it's the first of many. That there's other bits of the economy that the government looks to in exactly the same way. And you're right, it struck me very much that there was a model here that I hope to see replicated.
Well, thank you, Neil. And you know, I felt when the report was finished that it'd be very easy for someone, not necessarily me, but someone to write a volume 2 and a volume 3. So I very much agree with that. But I really want us to move as a country beyond reports and into implementation. And you know, I'm optimistic that that's what we're going to do. But I'd really love to see, you know, this get done, and I'd really love to see it become a model for the other parts of our economy for certain.
Well, certainly, if the general consensus is somehow indicative of the action that's going to be taken, I think, I think we're going to see action here. Goodness knows, I looked at some of the projected unemployment rates that were going to come out of the back of this COVID Brexit fandango is probably the good Scottish word to stick on to the twin things that are going to affect our economy, and the tremendous negative impact that's going to have for youth unemployment in particular over the next 5, 10, 15 years. We need other things to be focused on within our economy, and it certainly feels like there's the opportunity, and as I say, we're focused on education, but to me that is always the thing that's the root of it, because if we didn't have the quality of academic institutions that we've got, I think we would be lost, really. I think we would really struggle. The other things, the infrastructure feels like problems we can solve, albeit it takes a lot of money. And the funding thing, I think if you've got the first two you get, now that doesn't mean you can go at it unstructured, but I think that naturally follows and builds, and again, back to the ecosystem point. But look, Mark, I've taken up more than enough of your time. My sincere thanks for joining me. I've really enjoyed hearing about the report, getting your take on it, the ecosystem piece in particular, really interesting, and really just hearing about your career today and getting your views. So thanks very much for joining me.
Thank you, Neil. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. Thank you.